Okay. So far, it's just us. Oh, okay. Oh. Hey, thanks to everyone who has joined, and we'll get started in just a few minutes. Looks like people are trickling in. So. I appreciate everyone who's joined on time and a little bit early. That'll help us get started on time. So thank you. Welcome. I see a few additional people are coming in to the call. Thank you so much. We're excited to have you. We'll be getting started in just a couple of minutes. Oh, excellent. Based on the attendees, I think we're going to have some really good questions at the Q&A session. This looks like some people that have a lot of knowledge and experience in this space as well. So this will be good.
Yeah, people are very prompt, aren't they, Alicia?
They
I wish my meetings had this level of promptness to them.
Yes, people are quite prompt. It's lovely to see. Yeah, very, very excited for people to be joining, and glad they were able to join a few minutes early. And yes, we'll get started in about a minute or so. But yes.
I think we've got a wide variety too, people from all over.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should be encouraging them to be thinking of difficult questions for us, Manji, shouldn't we?
Yes.
Or maybe not.
Be nice, be nice.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, we are at the 9 o'clock, and I think there's going to be a lot for us to discuss. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it off, and I'm sure there'll be others that join us as we continue the discussion, and we'll look forward to having them participate as well. So Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the link between gender equality and ESG. We often approach ESG and gender equality as two separate areas, even though some might include gender equality as part of the S. Today, we'll talk about how ESG and gender equality are inextricably linked and the impact that gender equality has on each aspect of ESG. My name is Alicia Williams, and I'm an associate here at Watson in our governance advisory practice. Before we go too much further, I want to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands on which each of us work, live, and play. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improve our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. Please take a moment today in reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and consider how each of us can, in our own way, try to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Okay, and now with that, just a few housekeeping points. So if you encounter any technical difficulties, my colleague Jenna is available to troubleshoot. You can contact Jenna either through the chat function or at the phone number on your screen. We'll be running today until about 1 p.m. Eastern or 10 a.m. Pacific. Our panelists are looking forward to answering your questions on this topic, and we're saving some time at the end for what will hopefully be a robust Q&A session in the latter part of the hour. There is a distinct Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to post your questions there throughout the discussion, and we will look to answer them as soon as possible. However, in the event that we run out of time, we are recording this session and we'll aim to circle back with you on any unanswered questions at a later date and perhaps to have a more in-depth conversation. Okay, and so now I'd like to bring in our two amazing panelists today, Manijay and Martin. Manijay is a senior governance consultant and lawyer at Watson, where she helps boards of directors and their committees through their governance reviews, board and director evaluations, and policy manual development, and advises boards with respect to governance structures, frameworks, and capacity assessments. She has over 25 years of experience in governance and law, working with entities of virtually every type. With extensive experience as a director, corporate secretary, and general counsel, and a deep knowledge of emerging governance issues, such as ESG, Manijay provides thoughtful insight and expertise to boards and management teams that are practical, effective, and enhance their organization's success. Martin is the Chief Strategy Officer for iSAW, the International Strategic Accelerator for Women, whose mission is to accelerate by 10 times the pace at which gender equality will be achieved in the workplace. He brings his passion for driving improved business performance to create innovative solutions to ensure that iSAW can deliver its ambition. Martin has a wide range of commercial and digital technology-based leadership experiences in diverse business areas with the BP conglomerate and later with the UK's Ministry of Defence. Martin is a highly empathetic leader and has always seen the value of diversity and inclusion in leadership in delivering better business outcomes. So thank you to both of you for joining us today. Really looking forward to this conversation. So, Manijay and Martin, there are some pretty stark statistics about gender equality. According to the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Index, that's a mouthful, which measures the gender gap based on 4 key dimensions, it will take 151 years to attain gender parity in economic participation, and an average of 132 years to gain gender parity when all 4 dimensions are combined. And of the 145 economies that were measured In 2020 and 2021, only 60% saw progress over that year, with 40% experiencing declines. So, Martin, my first question goes to you. Tell us about the report. Why did iSAW decide to conduct this study?
Yeah, thank you, Alicia. Thank you for a great setup. And just let me say hi to everybody else that's taking the time out of their busy days to join us here today. It is a very stark statistic, isn't it? The way I like to think about it, it's more than 5 generations. I can't even calculate what that means in terms of a great-great-grandson or daughter or whatever it is before we'll achieve gender parity. And you know, part of the iSAW mission is it's just not acceptable, and we're looking for ways to try and make a difference, create almost an accelerator by collaborating with others that are doing this. And we know that one of the things that is going to make a difference is that we provide information and insight to people that are trying to understand why they should spend more time on gender equality if they're running a business, or if they've got another organization, how they can get traction if they know why, but want to know how to get into action. So we're always looking for ways to build the hook between gender equality as perhaps a social responsibility conversation and better business. And of course, the whole topic of ESG is something that has come to the fore over the last probably 3-4 years. And in some countries, it's become really a major topic for publicly listed corporations. So we thought, well, let's see if that provides us with a hook for getting companies more interested in gender equality. Because if ESG fascinates them, then maybe we can drag ESG along with that we can drag gender equality along with that fascination. So that was the kind of main purpose of getting into it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And there is such a connection between gender equality and ESG, as we're going to continue to discuss further. So Martin, the report makes some fairly provocative comments. For instance, it says, the largely male-dominated decisions to date have left the wider aspects of sustainable business severely degraded. So, did anything come out of the report's findings that surprised you?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's good to pick on, I'll call it that somewhat stark negative, which was a comment pulled from one of our bits of research, which, by the way, was done independently from us. We collaborated with the University of Arizona. I should give them a little plug because they did some fantastic work for us. Although we then overlaid that with some experts in gender equality, DE&I, and ESG. But to your point, did anything surprise us? Because you never know when you get into this. Are you just reinforcing your previous hypotheses, or do you learn something new? I'd say going into it, a hypothesis would be that the S, as you introduced this, the S in ESG would be something that would be positively impacted if there was a positive movement in any organization around gender equality. It's one aspect of the internal society, if you like, that the S is pointing to. But I think the biggest thing that came out of the research was that the impact of women and gender equality aspects came out on all dimensions of the E, the S, and the G. And in fact, in the report, and I think you've got a little slide we can maybe just throw up for everybody, where we create a little Venn diagram. And I'm not going to expect people to read all the words in this. It's a little small for that. But it's just to kind of give the visual impression that we found there were many aspects of where some aspect of equality had an impact on ESG. But perhaps the biggest one was the one around governance. And we actually quite often, when ESG is shown visually, and this Venn diagram is not unique to us, E is often at the top, and then S and G are underneath. We've moved them around because for the purpose of our study, we actually found that if women are in leadership positions and there is an equality at that leadership level, then the whole system of governance, the whole system of internal controls are influenced by those feminine traits around empathy, around a greater sense of social responsibility, around collaboration. And all of these leadership traits then start to positively infiltrate aspects of environmental issues, aspects of wider governance in terms of how decisions are made across the whole of the organization. So for us, we found this virtuous spiral that if you create in your governance activity more balanced decision making, it creates a dynamo effect for the rest of the ESG agenda. That's probably the biggest single takeaway for us from the whole study.
That's fantastic. And as somebody who works in governance, I can see how that connection would be there. So Manoj, let's kind of dig into the ESG a little bit more and how boards are looking at that. I've got a few questions here that I'm going to kind of group together for you. So you do a lot of work with boards on ESG. How are boards approaching ESG? And when you talk to them about it, what are the aspects they're most focused on? And why do you think they've chosen those areas?
Thanks, Alicia, and welcome to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about this topic. I think, being in the world of governance, the concept of gender equality is something we've been talking about for a very, very long time, and the importance of it. And of course, that has morphed to ESG, for many companies, that's been around for a long time in their ethos, and for many, they're just starting. So I would say in terms of how boards are approaching ESG, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Boards are at different places on the ESG governance maturity curve. And so how they're approaching it is a bit all over the map. There's some that have taken steps, or they're starting to take steps, but the approaches are a bit piecemeal. They might have a committee that is just starting. They're still figuring out what that should look like. They might have done some education. There's a number of different things that they're just starting to do, but I'd say, in that sort of camp, some are very paralyzed, not really sure kind of where to go, which is why we often sometimes get a call too, because they're trying to figure that out. Others have definitely taken a much more meaningful, holistic action. They're thinking more broadly about what do their boards need to oversee, and they're thinking about it in the context of their purpose and their strategy. Some are actually starting to, if they haven't already defined their purpose, they are defining that purpose, and everything is starting to be tied to that purpose, and their strategy development is tied to that. So then they're thinking about it more holistically. What skill sets do we need? What perspectives do we need? What frameworks do we need to be putting in place? What do we need to shift? And they're weaving that into everything that they're doing. And so some have been doing this for a while. And for those that are, if they might have been doing it, but they might just be starting to formalize how it actually looks and how they're disclosing around that as well. It really just depends. It might be the size of the company, the industry, the sector that they're in, their stage of growth. There's a lot of different factors that come into play. What environment they're regulated under, that kind of thing. So, I would say as a whole, it is ultimately about sort of the sophistication, the importance of the people around the table. As we start to see different perspectives around the table, it is starting, these issues are coming to the discussion, which is very encouraging. I think what I would say that has shifted in the last couple of years, despite all of the all over the map approach, is just the conversation, recognizing that there does need to be a meaningful approach to ESG. And the conversation is shifting from, we need to do this because we're required to, or, you know, there's pressure on us to do this, or there's a trade-off to our profitabilities, but we're going to have to do it anyway because our regulators are telling us to do so. And it's really I'm starting to see that shift, that there's an opportunity here. You know, and I think this is what the report is trying to get at, is that this is leading to better business outcomes. And we're starting to see that shift in the language of, okay, there actually is lots of opportunity here. And that's, you know, I think that's really great to see. It's very encouraging to see that. In terms of what boards are most focused on, again, it really is a bit all over the map, depending on where they're at on the maturity scale. But I'll kind of give some sort of generalizations of things that I'm seeing in our work. And I am going to start with that G, because that is obviously a big part of our work. But I think, you know, having it at the top of the Venn diagram, I think makes sense. This is where it all starts. So boards for a long time have been talking about diversity and thinking about board composition. Public companies are required to disclose. And, you know, in Canada, you're required to disclose your the composition of your boards and your executive teams, the gender concepts as well. So I think this is probably where we're starting to see a bit more consistency in terms of what they're looking at. It doesn't mean that the approach needs to, you know, there's still lots of evolution that needs to happen, but that's where we're seeing a bit more consistency. So focus on board composition and diversity, not just gender, but diversity more broadly as well. A lot of focus on board effectiveness with the people around the table. It's, you know, it's thinking about the dynamics, the structures, the practices, and all of that goes into how effective the board is in overseeing the organization as a whole. And the board's oversight of those key emerging issues like ESG, which is a number of different issues. The S, the social side of ESG, in terms of what boards are looking at, I would say this is probably where we see the biggest shift. Boards have always had the oversight of the CEO life cycle, so that's been very important. And more boards are getting more focused on an intentional approach to that and all the different aspects of what that's involved, so that they're not blindsided when something unexpected happens, so that they can continue to support their CEO and strengthening the company and achieving its goals, those kinds of things. But one of the big shifts that's happened in the last number of years is boards recognizing the need to have a different approach to human capital oversight, to actually have an approach to human capital oversight. And that encompasses a number of things. That's organizational culture, that's the diversity, equity, and inclusion within the organization, gender parity, pay equity. There's a number of different elements of that. And I would say the pandemic really shone a light on that. The employee piece of it, you know, this became more and more a board issue. It was so fundamental to all of the success of the organization, the employee piece. And so that has happened. And then as a result of the pandemic, we're also seeing a greater, you know, the war on talent as well, which has shone a greater light on that as well. So that's really encouraging to see that. On the E is interesting. It's probably where I'm seeing most divergence on this. And I think, you know, companies that are in certain sectors, resource sectors, extractive sectors, those kinds of things, textiles, climate change, carbon emissions is a very big part of it. Financial services, it's impacting their investment profiles. So it's there, it's a part of the language. But other areas that I think we're having larger conversations around are water management, you know, with flooding and with droughts and a whole bunch of things going on. That is becoming really, really critical and a bigger focus. And biodiversity as well. That's another area of thinking as well that the boards are starting to think about. Although, you know, again, it really depends on where they're at on the maturity scale around that. Overlaying all of that, reconciliation with Indigenous people. That is incredibly fundamental. And I think that weaves into all of what we're talking about today. And it impacts the E, the ES, the G, but it's a fundamental shift as well. So we're seeing more conversation around that.
Wow. So much there, Manoj, to unpack and think about, and so much opportunity. And so thinking about that opportunity and how boards are looking at that from an ESG perspective. But Martin, I want to take it back then to, you know, why should companies be thinking more about gender equality? It sounds like there's, well, perhaps all over the map, but they are beginning to do a lot more thinking on ESG. So what do you think about that, and what that means in terms of gender equality?
Yeah, I mean, it's so important. I mean, as Maniji was saying in the wider ESG context, unless you have business leaders thinking about ESG or gender equality as an inherent part of their strategic business, then it's always going to be something that sits to one side, and will be looked at when perhaps people say you need to go look at that, whether that's from a legal framework or a shareholder perspective. So and I'll get to the why they should care, but it's almost before the why should care is how do we get them to care, right? And you may say, well, it's circular. If you can tell them why, then surely that will help. But I think the learning we found on this relatively early journey in trying to move the dial on this is it's a mindset issue. And it's, I have the same. I have had a schooling in the corporate world where if it hadn't been for my exposure in many countries across the world to having to deal with diversity, to having to deal with mixed teams and seeing the benefit of them, I don't think my mindset would be as easily switched on when I read a report that highlights the strong correlation between women in your team and innovation, or between women in your team and psychological safety, between women in your team and the ability to be more resilient and adaptive. Because all of that's out there. But unless you've had the experience, you almost don't look for it. You don't read it through that lens. And so what we're trying to do is to find a way to shift the mindset. And Maniji talked about the culture of an organization so that it starts to think about gender equality through its normal ways of doing business. And we've tried to think of a way to maybe help with that. And there's a little framework, which I think you've got another slide of. So apologies for everybody. I tend to think in pictures. And again, I won't drain the slide, but I'll talk a little bit to it. Like most slides, I've done it from starting from the topic I care about, which is gender equality in the context of my role inside of iSAW, which talks about current initiatives and the things that iSAW focuses on as accelerators, and then all the way through leading indicators to strategic business outcomes. But actually, the conversation that I tend to have with business people is right to left. I say, talk to me about what you care about most in your business, what things that you're trying to drive improve performance in. Then let's have a conversation, and these are the strategic business outcomes. And that could be, as I said earlier, it could be greater adaptability, customer retention, market share, bottom line profitability. And then we can have a conversation around these things in the middle called leading indicators. These are the traits inside of an organization that, if you have enough of them, will positively impact those lagging indicators of business performance. Psychological safety, the right mix of leadership traits, overall team coherence and performance, balanced decision making. And there's so much has been written about the linkage between these and better business outcomes. And then what we've done is to provide the link between what you would do around your gender and your talent management and your diversity and inclusion in the wider sense that then impacts those leading indicators. And I've called one out. There have been so many studies that say if you have a balanced team, then a notion of psychological safety can be created. And if you're in an organization where you need to fail fast because you're regularly having to innovate and try out new products and services, then if you don't create an environment where psychological safety is the norm, then people are always going to find ways to dress up their failure as success. In other words, success equals failure plus explanation. How many people have sat in front of a PowerPoint slide that shows, here's my target, here's my outcome, and then here's these little blocks that explain how I got to that lower outcome. And that's not what we want. We want to say, well, actually, that lower outcome was a learning journey, and what did you learn from it? What are we going to do differently from the next time? So this is a model that's trying to ultimately say, you can do different things around your practices for recruitment, your practices for promotion, the behaviors that you support in the office that are more looking for contributions for people who are more naturally silent, and many of these things that work for all diverse groups work for women and vice versa. We're happy to be focused on women. Clearly, I'm based in a country where we don't have an Indigenous challenge to deal with, but we still have a huge women issue to deal with. But the same approach to this works for any group that is not fully represented in their organization. So bringing these linkages all the way through to better business performance is the way that we're approaching it. And we think giving businesses the tools to then make that happen, then they might embed it more, and they should care because they're going to be competing for talent. And as Manji said, post the pandemic, we've had the great quit or the great resignation, and we're finding more and more people have elected not to participate in the workforce, even though they're in the workforce participation age group, and that is skewed yet again to women. So if we want to bring these women back into the workplace, we have to create that culture and that mindset that recognizes the value they bring. And by the way, that value is recognized in so many studies in terms of better business outcomes.
Yeah, thank you for that, Martin. I think it's really about creating an inclusive environment and allowing everyone within that environment to be productive, right? I think every company would want all of their employees to be productive and contributing. We don't want those people who are just sitting on the sidelines and not able to bring their full best to the work that they're doing and to the organization that they're a part of. So thank you. Manjay, I have another question for you. A key takeaway from the report is that the governance is where the acceleration opportunity driven by gender equality can most readily create momentum to achieve a sustainable set of ESG and strategic outcomes. What are some of the things boards need to focus on as we think about how to help more women get to the boardroom and into the C-suite?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think governance is where it starts. It's the tone at the top. It's the people around the table. I mean, the board is ultimately accountable for the organization's success, and so it's got to start that's there. It's a tough one, right? I think I love about the report and thinking through the 3 horizons. Is, Horizon 3, of course, is aspirational, but that's where it should be, right? I think, what do we want to achieve and why? And at the end of the day, you want a stronger organization, more profitable, whatever it might be, better able to achieve its purpose. You want it to have a long-term impact to broader society, whatever that may be. So from a governance perspective, I think it really, boards need to have a structured and systematic way of how they deal with this and how they address this. And it can be overwhelming, but one of the reasons I like the horizons is you got to start somewhere. Horizon 1 and 2, it's a way of thinking about where you start. And I think, where does the board start? You know, we've been talking about this for a very long time, but start with your own diversity. Have a much more intentional approach to building gender diversity. We've talked about public companies requiring to be disclosing it, but the needle still hasn't moved, even though we've had those in place for some time now. And, you know, and some of them, what we're also seeing is, you know, many organizations, you know, through those reports don't necessarily have targets in place. And I've never really been a fan of targets. You never want to be the person that's there to, you know, because you're female and no other. There's many women, lots of women, we bring lots of different skill sets of it. But I like to think of it from instead, we talk about it as composition goals. I think from your board perspective, what's your composition goal? And it should be 50-50. It should be gender parity. It should be that high. It shouldn't be 30% club. It should be much higher than that. And so there needs to be a very concerted effort within that to seek the diversity, the skills, the experiences for that strong board, to see all the different perspectives that are coming, both on an opportunity perspective, but also some of the blind spots that you might otherwise be missing. So focus on reaching those composition goals and start to focus also on a broader view of the skills matrix. So again, many organizations we deal with have a skills matrix, many don't, which is surprising. So start with putting one in place. And if you do have one, put a broader picture on that. So don't just focus on people with CEO experience or that kind of experience. When we're talking about different aspects that are an organization touches and what's important to the organization and who's impacted by the organization's activities, it's important to think about those relevant perspectives that will impact the strategy, the risk profile of the organization, the customer base, the community base that it is involved with, and think about it from that perspective. What are those key perspectives that you're going to need to bring to the table? And often gender will intersect with some of that as well. So it's really important. And it doesn't stop there. It's not just about who's around the table and what the composition of the people are around the table. Those perspectives need to be brought to the forefront. There needs to be that psychological safety around the board table. And so there needs to be a real focus on having the optimal board culture and healthy dynamics, healthy personal dynamics. Board work is teamwork. And you need to have every player on the team playing an important role in bringing those perspectives forward. And they can only do that if they feel that there are good, healthy dynamics. And that doesn't mean everybody needs to agree. In fact, it should be constructive debate, healthy debate. We recently talked about the phenomenon of our Canadian polite culture, which we're finding is holding people back from those discussions as well. But this is all related. So it's thinking about how to bring those perspectives forward in a meaningful way, have strong chair that's facilitating it. And a good way to kind of do that is to just start with a bit of an assessment or a gap, like just where are your gaps? What are those blind spots that you're missing? What are those perspectives? How is the conversation around the board table, and thinking about that as well. And then I think from there, a key piece really is around the board really needing to think about the talent management strategy, putting that on their agenda as well, because, Martin, you talked about talent attraction and retention as being a leading indicator. I think this is probably one of the biggest areas that we are seeing as a risk and an opportunity for companies. And so that needs to be front and center on the board agenda. There's our younger population in particular, it matters, when they're looking for opportunities with organizations, they're looking to see how much organizations care about these issues. So I think that has to be top and center, and then thinking about that from your leadership and succession plans and building that into that as well. So many things, but it's a multifaceted approach.
Yeah. And I really love how you talked about the person doesn't need to be a CEO to be on the board, because there are so many different perspectives that are valuable and can help move a board forward and help move an organization forward that don't require that particular skill set. And as we recognize that, I think that's a really wonderful thing. So thank you. And so Martin, a similar question to you. I'm going to say, what do you think is stopping companies, but also what are some things that that companies can do to get more women on the board and into the
season? Yeah. I mean, if we start with the board, and I think some of the things that Maniji said absolutely apply. The sort of notion of setting a composition frame of your board, and it needs to be really aspirational rather than, which is different from a target, which needs to be realistic relative to your current feeder pool. Because I've seen these targets when you do the math, that it's impossible to achieve in terms of the number of people you'd have to hire or promote to achieve that level of. So I think this notion of aspiration, which says we've got to find a way to get that 50-50. But I do think thinking about it all the way through the organization and creating that strong feeder pool is really, really important. And then, and I know I'm going to get myself into hot water when I say this, but I'll do it anyway. Since you said the Canadians are polite, then I'm a Scot and we're not maybe as polite. So maybe that'll be my cover for this. But
big generalization, I know. But
no, that's right. There we go. Yeah, exactly. I know, but we're allowed to paint ourselves with these broad brushes for this purpose, perhaps, even though we know that's always dangerous. But I think there is I'll put it in this way. I think we all can fall into the trap of hiring in our own likeness.
Yeah.
And so one of the interesting things is about role models. And one of the interesting things is when men at senior levels, often sometimes supported by men in HR positions, are hiring, they're hiring in their own likeness. And they then end up with women that are more masculine than men. And therefore the value, because all of this is about it's not a gender in itself. The gender is almost the easy reference point for feminine and masculine traits. And what we're trying to get is sufficient balance of those traits. That's what creates the better business outcome. Now, the fact that most women have more feminine traits than men is why it's easy to say, let's keep it as gender. And that is also very important here. But in the context of business outcomes, you're looking for those balance and traits. And so often I see so-called role models of women not being the kind of women that the rest of the women organization aspire to be. They're sometimes referred to as queen bees. I've heard, and this isn't my term, honest, this is what a woman has shared with me, which is they act as second-rate men. And that's the last thing we want. And so therefore, thinking about that recruitment of those feminine leadership traits in the women that they're bringing through the organization and adjusting your promotion and your recruitment processes to look for those traits, I think is one of the big things that can be done to move the dial here.
Yeah. I really appreciate that you broke that out between, it's not just whether it's someone who identifies specifically as a female or a woman, it's the traits, those qualities, those characteristics that sometimes we associate with particular individuals and particular genders. It's bringing those together to ensure that we have sort of a whole person. Like I think about my two children and they're very different people, but if I could put them together, they would be like this one perfect, human being. And so I think it's about how bringing those qualities together really makes us a better society. So thank you. So Maniji, what are some things that you've seen that have worked well for boards that are interested in gender equality, both at the board and at the executive leadership level?
I think the starting point is investing in education and conversation around these topics. You gotta socialize. It's it can be a tough conversation in some environments to have this. In other environments, it's not. It's already well accepted, right? But for where it is challenging, I think it is important to start with bringing in some education, socializing the topics, bringing people along, and it should be practical and focused. I think It's not just, telling boards what they should know. It really is focused on, how does this impact the work that you do? How does this make you stronger as a board, as an organization, and getting people aligned on that. And I don't think it's just a one type of session, a one hour webinar or a 1 hour, some conversation at a board meeting. I think it's something that you need to build in as a regular part. And this is like, your governance committees can be, they can be an owner of this type of process and build it into board development plans as well. And I think I would, I talked about the skills and competency matrix earlier, dust that off. If you haven't already built one, start building it, right? Just start there. That's worked really well. And just take that much more expansive view of it, I think, and start asking questions around, how do you encourage those different perspectives to be forward? It's not just how do they be there, but what are some tools that we can use to actually get that? One of the things we talked about with the Canadian culture is, maybe you should actually have some more intentional approaches in the boardroom around, can I have another perspective? Can I have a different perspective? Can somebody take this opposite viewpoint, intentionally, so that we can really have robust debate around that? And I think that's linked very much to gender and diversity more broadly as well, in order to have that as well. So I think those are some of the things that have worked really well. Another area is really just when boards take a more intentional view around re-examining their structures, their practices, their frameworks. And that assessment that I talked about earlier can really help get it off the ground in a meaningful way. And, that is a good way of starting. Okay. And then bringing the board along. What can we reasonably shift? What is practical? And where do we want to get to? And build a good plan around that. Because it can't happen all overnight. It does take time, but you start building some intention around that.
Yeah. And it does. It takes time to bring people along and to recognize where they're at. And but it's a critical piece to be able to advance the message forward. So I think we've come to the time when we're going to move into our Q&A. And there are some really good questions that have come through. So I'm just going to put those out there and see what you both think about them. Martin, maybe this first question is for you. The participant says, why are we talking about equality and not equity? And I think the language is important to key outcomes, and she's interested, or they are interested to hear your thoughts on this.
So it's a great, Denise, thank you. A great question. And in fact, when I saw it there, I thought, and we've toyed with this, and you're spot on. Equality of opportunity is one thing, but if you can't create the equity out of that, then it's not. And we've struggled whether we call it gender equity or gender equality. We stuck with equality in our language because we were springboarding our mission off the World Economic Forum's statistic, which tends to talk about women's economic equality. But you're absolutely right. I don't know what your background is. It may be you're a DE&I specialist, an HR specialist. You're absolutely right. And it's actually, in fact, you've asked that question. It's great to hear something we need to watch, that it doesn't trip us up. Because the last thing I would want to have is to lose the impact of what we're trying to do by choosing that the wrong word there. And I do absolutely get the distinction. So I think I'd say we've thought about it. We've stuck with the equality, but we've actually been thinking about whether we shift our language to use the equity one. I think it's less commonly used, but by experts, the distinction is spot on, and we probably need to think about the sensitivity around that.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I think that again, going back to some of the things that we've been talking about today, The equality, the numbers, that kind of thing is the starting point, but it shouldn't stop there. The equity piece is such a fundamental piece to bringing those perspectives forward, to making sure people feel comfortable bringing their perspectives forward, and what we're hoping to achieve by having gender equality actually comes out to the table as well. So it is there's a critical link. It's a very good point.
Yeah, and I think managing, if I could just, sorry, Alicia, just your point earlier, and it's the targets or quota or whatever, right? Which is, and you expressed, every woman I've worked with in my corporate life, has always bristled at the thought of there being targets, and therefore they're seen as the token woman on any particular team. But and I'm going to link it back to equity, but I do think the notion of meritocracy is not a completely objective thing either.
No.
And therefore this notion, right? And therefore, if you're interviewing two candidates and you're ranking them and you're looking for a mix in your team that you don't have, for me, the tiebreaker, because if I get two very capable candidates, there's a thin line between, the team mix may be the decider. And that helps with because the more you then are using your equity target of the 50-50 to influence, will get you to your equality quicker. Yeah. And that's, I think, how. So I just wanted to kind of springboard off your comment there. Sorry, Alicia, I didn't mean to.
Oh no, not at all. And you all have the. I appreciate very much what you have to say. And so I would just add to that as well. I think equity is the mechanism by which we try to achieve equality. And so really it's about all the things that both of you have talked about, building this from a very deep level, starting throughout the entire organization, making sure that we are bringing women up through the process and holding leadership accountable. And that is actually one of the other questions is, what is, how do we ensure there is accountability at the executive leadership level? And is ESG reporting going to allow for this? So I think that's a question for both of you.
Yeah. This is another area in evolution is the different reporting standards that are out there, which, by the way, none of them are mandatory yet, but we're seeing greater and greater adoption, and there's a bit of they're a bit disparate as well as to what reporting is. But what I'm encouraged to see, there's been a real push in the last few years over more integrated, standardized reporting and disclosure. The International Sustainability Standards Board recently just published a draft IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards, which encompasses all of these, is intended to encompass all of these kinds of things. The reporting standards themselves, I would say all of them have a commonality in wanting disclosure around a number of things, but one of those is around board composition, executive composition, how people are thinking about the different skill sets, diversity, all of those different aspects. It's broader. So we're asking for disclosure around that. What I think is missing is really kind of making that link between the reporting around that and the link to strategy and therefore better business outcomes. I think that's missing from the frameworks that I'm seeing so far. I am starting to see, more companies in their sustainability reporting because this is becoming, talent management is becoming such an important part of their strategy. So then it does encompass some of the, the gender equality that we've been talking about, but the reporting standards aren't quite there. And I think they do need to be stronger around that. And I think, yes, then it starts to become more about an accountability thing.
Yeah. And I know in the work that we do, particularly when we work with organizations on diversity, equity, and inclusion, we encourage them to put in place performance standards and performance reviews for their CEOs so that it really does start at the top, holding people accountable, and then hopefully that trickles down through the rest of the organization. So I think there's a number of ways to be able to do that work. And hopefully there will be some standards that come into play that actually reinforce that as well. Mm-hmm. So I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. Another one that's in the chat is, can you mention how you work with creating inclusion and psychological safety as the first step?
Yeah, maybe I try that. What is psychological safety is something that starts with when a team comes together. It's the tone of how discussions take place right at the start. It's about the acceptance that every contribution that is made is a valued contribution. That doesn't mean to say that it is then allowed to be taken all the way through to the outcome, but it's that starting with the notion of allow people to make contribution, encourage people that don't normally speak to make them. When there's a mistake done, you don't point a finger at somebody. It's the language we use, even as a team. You don't want to be pointing outside of the team to others that may have impacted how well you're doing. All of that tone that is created around respect and recognition and value of individual contribution makes people feel that they're in a safe place. Mm-hmm. And if they're in a safe place, then the silly thought that they had in their head that they don't want to say because they think it might be silly and they don't want to be called out, they offer it up. And then somebody else says, actually, that's not a silly thought. That was something I was thinking. And when they build on that, somehow something different occurs. Something that wasn't in the room in any one individual head comes out into the room and becomes a much more powerful way forward than could have been created otherwise. It is when it's done well, it is one of the most powerful ways of working. That is one of these leading indicators that one of the other questioners talked about are so important and don't get focused on. And if I link that back to the accountability in terms of what gets measured, gets done and gets recognized and drives motivation, everything else. If organizations only measure outcomes and not how they are measured, then you're never going to shift the mindset and the behaviors of an organization. So if you focus on some of these leading indicators, many of which are about how rather than the what, and you focus them right the way down, as you said, Alicia, from the CEO in his performance contract to the board, all the way down through the organization, that there is an equal weighting of both the what you do and the how you do it, then it really starts to shift the whole tone of the climate of an organization towards these inclusive behaviors, these opportunities for greater psychological safety.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. There's a couple of ways of sort of rounding that out as well, like in the CEO and setting those goals and beyond that, the team goals as well, is what we're starting to see more shift. It's not just the financial goals or those kinds of things as well. The outcomes are also measured on what are those inputs and what are those, you're trying to create a culture that allows for different perspectives, innovation, all those different kinds of things. So what are those inputs that need to go into that? That is now becoming a broader part of the CEO performance measures as well. On the board front, and I would say this applies equally to any team, whether you're in senior management or beyond, often the conversation around how we're actually going to create that environment of psychological safety just doesn't happen. So I think even starting with the conversation, and it's not about, we're going to oversee all these different things. And, it's not about responsibilities. It's around how are we going to create mutual expectations for one another, around how we're going to make sure every single person feels heard, feels they can be heard, and do that, and having a deliberate conversation around that is revisited. Are we achieving what we set out to do? That is really, really a fundamental part of the board to creating those healthy dynamics, but any team should be doing that on a regular basis as well.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And I think it's a lovely one to end on. And so let's all of us walk away from this and think about how we can help to create more inclusive environments within the organizations that we work in. And but unfortunately, I think brings us to time. We want to make sure that everyone's able to get off to their next meetings in a timely fashion. So a big, big thank you to you, Manijay and Martin, for your time today, sharing your expertise on ESG and gender equality. It really has been a great discussion. And so I also want to thank Jenna from our Watson team for her, excuse me, I'm getting a little tongue twisted at the end of this here, for her behind the scenes help and technical support. So thank you so much. And I have put on the screen here our contact information. I'd just like to thank all of you for joining us today. If you haven't had an opportunity to read the report, we will be sending that out, as well as a recording of this session today. And if there were questions that we didn't get to, and I think there were a few, we will circle back with those individuals. And please feel free to be in touch with us. Our contact information is there on the screen, and you're welcome to get in touch with any of us. And you can also find us on LinkedIn. So just want to say once more, thank you again, everyone, for your time. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
Everyone. Bye. We stay on.